My name is Tessa Caldwell. I'm 26 years old, and this happened 2 summers ago in Wayne National Forest, Ohio. I remember every detail so vividly that it still keeps me awake on restless nights. If I close my eyes, I can picture the winding roads we took to get there, the heavy canopy of trees that pressed in on all sides, and the hush that fell over the forest as if the land itself were drawing a deep breath. It was supposed to be a carefree weekend with 3 of my closest friends, Dylan, Jade, and Mike. Instead, it became the longest 3 days of my life. I first heard about the trip from Dylan. He's 27, a constant seeker of excitement, and he thrives on the kind of stories that end up spooking everyone else. He told us he found a perfect spot, deep in Wayne National Forest, far away from the usual tourist crowds, and that we'd experience real wilderness. I wasn't entirely sold on the idea. My comfort zone extends to well-marked hiking trails and campsites with visible neighbors. But Dylan's excitement is contagious, and before I could think it through, I said I was in. Jade, who's 25 and perhaps the most empathetic person I know, was more hesitant. She's not against nature or camping. She loves the outdoors as long as there's a sense of safety. But when Dylan teased the possibility of haunted corners of Wayne National Forest, places where rumored witches or shapeshifters were said to roam, she expressed serious doubt. I can still hear her soft voice saying, "We're not going ghost hunting, right?" And Dylan, with that cocky grin of his, replying, No, nothing like that." The irony is that even though we didn't go there with the intention of ghost hunting, something sure found us. Mike, who's 26, was probably the easiest to convince. He's our resident handyman and comedic relief. If something breaks, Mike can rig a solution with duct tape and a prayer. He's the one you want around when you're messing with an old RV on questionable roads. And that's precisely what we had. A battered RV that Dylan had borrowed from his cousin, who used it primarily for tailgating at football games. It had seen better days. The engine made all kinds of sputtering noises, and the overhead lights sometimes flickered for no apparent reason. Mike assured us it would be fine, as long as we didn't push it too hard. We set off on a Friday morning. The drive was about 3 hours from where we lived, but it felt longer. Once we left the main highways, the roads thinned into winding rural routes lined with farmland and the occasional cluster of tall trees. Dylan drove first, blasting some upbeat rock music to keep the energy high, while Jade and I sat at the little table in back, double-checking our route. We had a map, but it was a few years old and didn't necessarily have all the new forest access roads. Dylan insisted it would be more adventurous that way. Jade gave me a worried look, but I reassured her we'd be fine. Besides, what's the worst that could happen? When we finally reached the edges of Wayne National Forest, I noticed a change in the air. Maybe it was my imagination, but the sunlight looked dimmer as it filtered through the dense leaves. We turned onto a narrow gravel path that Dylan claimed led to a secret campsite. According to him, a friend of a friend had once camped there and raved about its solitude. It sounded nice in theory. No neighbors, no kids screaming, no bright RVs parked in rows. We'd have the area all to ourselves. Jade caught me glancing out the window at the thickening forest, and she gently pressed her hand to mine. I could see the question in her eyes. "Are you sure about this?" Mike eventually took over the driving because Dylan kept fiddling with the radio and complaining that the engine didn't sound quite right. We lurched over a series of ruts, our belongings rattling around us. Finally, after what felt like an eternity of bumping along, the trees parted enough to reveal a clearing. A half-rotten wooden sign announced we were at some designated campsite, though it didn't look official. The sign was scrawled with marker, "Site 14, use at own risk." The edges of the wood had dark spots of mold. Dylan hopped out first, stretching his legs and inhaling deeply. "Smell that fresh air," he said. "This is the life." It was quiet, though. Too quiet, maybe. Usually, even in deep forest, you'd hear the chirping of birds or the buzz of insects. Here, I only heard the distant rustle of leaves. But maybe it was late in the afternoon and the wildlife was hiding from the heat. That's what I told myself. We started setting up camp. The RV had an awning, though Mike worried it might collapse if it got too windy. Jade and I took out fold-out chairs, a small grill, and all the groceries we brought. The plan was to spend 3 nights, do some hikes during the day, and gather around the campfire at night. It was a typical camping agenda, except for the persistent sense of isolation that gnawed at my subconscious. Still, I tried to brush it off. This was exactly what Dylan had promised, the ultimate getaway from civilization. Our first evening passed without incident. We roasted hot dogs, shared a few beers, and told embarrassing stories from our college days. Dylan, ever the entertainer, launched into retellings of local legends he'd read online, tales of witches who once lived in these hills, of cursed talismans found near the rivers, of hikers who went missing under bizarre circumstances. Jade shivered and asked him to stop, and even I found myself wishing he'd tone it down. But Mike tossed in the occasional joke, calling Dylan a discount ghost hunter. That broke the tension for a while. As the sun dipped low, we decided to turn in early. The 4 of us crammed into the RV, the air stuffy because the windows didn't open well, and the tiny overhead fan kept sputtering. I must have drifted off because the next thing I remember is waking suddenly to an eerie silence outside. I've camped in quiet places, but this was different. It felt like stepping into a vacuum. No crickets, no owls, nothing. The hairs on my arms stood up, and my heart thumped as I strained to hear any sign of life. Then Jade stirred next to me, mumbled something, and rolled over. Eventually, I convinced myself I was overreacting, so I closed my eyes again. The silence continued to press in, but weariness won out. The next morning, we woke up with the sun. While making instant coffee on our little propane stove, I noticed footprints around the RV that didn't match any of ours. They were elongated, almost like someone had worn gloves on their feet. I crouched down to get a better look, half expecting to see a double imprint from a weird shoe tread. But no, these prints had something like claw marks at the ends of what might have been toes. I called Dylan over. He stared at them with a mix of fascination and excitement. "Could be raccoons," he said, "or something bigger, maybe a bobcat." But I'd seen raccoon tracks before, and these weren't that. Bobcat tracks also looked different. Plus, these prints had a stride that seemed too large, and the shapes were downright strange. Mike tried to joke that Bigfoot had visited us in the night, but none of us laughed very hard. Jade was visibly unnerved. She asked if we should pack up and find a more populated campsite. Dylan, of course, insisted we were fine. "We're in the woods. Animals live here," he reasoned. "It's probably just some local wildlife." That didn't quite satisfy me, but I didn't want to be the paranoid one, so I kept quiet. Around mid-morning, we decided to go on a hike. We each carried water, snacks, and a small first aid kit. We also brought the old map. Jade and I wanted to stick to the marked trails, but Dylan argued that the entire point of this trip was to explore. Against my better judgment, I went along with his plan to follow what he called a secondary path. Mike shrugged and said, "Lead the way." So off we went. The deeper we ventured, the darker it felt. The canopy was so thick that midday sun barely filtered through. Thick vines draped across branches, and mossy logs forced us to climb or go around. After about an hour, we realized we had no clue where we were on the map. Dylan tried to match the contour lines, but the trail we were on didn't seem to exist. Jade's anxiety spiked. "Let's turn back," she said. "We'll lose the light soon." That's when we heard something, a faint voice calling from behind us. "Help," it said. We all froze. "Help me," repeated the voice, barely audible. It sounded eerily like me. My voice. I spun around, confusion jolting through me. "That can't be," I whispered. Dylan's face paled. Jade grabbed my arm. I felt her trembling. "Is someone hurt?" Mike called out, stepping forward. But no one answered, and we didn't hear branches rustling or footsteps or anything else that might indicate a person out there. I glanced at Dylan, hoping he'd have some logical explanation, but he looked as spooked as the rest of us. We decided to head back. None of us admitted we were scared, but the unspoken tension was clear as day. Fortunately, retracing our steps proved easier than I expected, and within 40 minutes, we were back at the campsite. The relief I felt seeing the battered old RV was enormous. Jade let out a breath like she'd been holding it the entire hike. Mike scanned the trees around us, muttering something about how it had to be an echo or a trick of the wind. The rest of the day passed uneventfully, though Jade stayed quiet. Even Dylan had lost some of his bravado. He spent the afternoon fussing with the grill and making a big show of marinating chicken for dinner, probably trying to distract himself. I sat in a fold-out chair, my camera resting on my lap, occasionally snapping pictures of the forest. At one point, the lens caught a flicker of movement in the bushes, but when I zoomed in, it was nothing, just a branch moving in the breeze, or so I told myself. After dinner, we sat around a small campfire. The atmosphere felt forced. Nobody was eager to share ghost stories this time. As darkness fell completely, the forest again grew unnervingly quiet. The crackle of the fire was the only sound, aside from our subdued conversation. Then the stench hit us, a foul odor like decaying roadkill mixed with stagnant water. It came in waves, drifting around us, making Jade gag. "What on earth is that smell?" she asked, covering her nose. None of us had an answer. Dylan stood up, shining a flashlight into the surrounding trees, but saw nothing. That smell just lingered. Feeling uneasy, we decided to call it a night. Inside the RV, we closed and locked the door. Mike checked the windows, made sure everything was secure. I tried to sleep, but my mind wouldn't settle. Every rustle outside turned my stomach into knots. Around midnight, I jolted awake to a scratching noise along the RV's exterior, a faint scraping like nails on metal. My heart raced, and I held my breath to listen. The sound moved around us from one side of the RV to the other, as if something was circling. Then it stopped. A moment later, there was a gentle knock on the door. I practically jumped out of my makeshift bed. Jade, wide-eyed, clutched my arm. Dylan scrambled to find his flashlight, shining it around the inside like that would help. Mike swore under his breath and tiptoed to the small window near the front. He pushed aside the curtain a few inches, but we only saw the dark silhouettes of trees swaying in the weak moonlight. Another knock, this time louder, knuckles on thin metal. None of us dared speak. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then a voice, "Let me in." At first, I thought it was Dylan playing a prank. But no, he was standing right next to me, stiff with fear. The voice from outside sounded almost like Jade's, but with a scratchy, distorted echo to it. "Let me in," it repeated, more insistent. Jade clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a gasp. Mike tried to gather his courage. He unlocked the glove compartment, pulled out a hunting knife, just in case. Dylan whispered, "Who's there?" No response. Seconds stretched out painfully, and then a loud bang rattled the door. I swear it almost buckled inward. For a moment I thought we were done for, that this thing, whatever it was, would tear the entire RV open like a tin can. Then silence. The stench returned, filling the cabin, sour and oppressive. We stayed up all night, huddled together, weapons within reach. The banging didn't return, nor did the voice. Eventually, the sky began to lighten, and with it came a rush of relief, as though the forest exhaled. Dylan dozed off, leaning against the back of the driver's seat, while Jade quietly cried into my shoulder. Mike, pale as a sheet, stared at the door, knife still gripped in his hand. When morning finally broke, we emerged to assess the damage. Deep scratches ran across the RV's metal siding, carving jagged lines down to the primer. Footprints, similar to the ones from before, formed a loose ring around the vehicle. Some prints overlapped ours, others strayed off into the trees. Worst of all, the stench still lingered, though fainter in the daylight. Jade insisted we leave right then. "We can find another campsite, somewhere more populated," she pleaded. Dylan agreed, which told me how shaken he was. Normally, he would have brushed it off or claimed it was a dream. Mike climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The engine sputtered, coughed, and died. He tried again with the same result. "Battery's shot, maybe," he muttered, rummaging in the toolbox. He checked cables, connections. Everything seemed intact. I could tell from the worry in his voice that it wasn't a simple fix. After about 30 minutes of tinkering, he threw up his hands. "We might need a jump," he said. But we had no other vehicles around, no other campers. Dylan's phone was dead, Jade's had no signal, and my phone was at only 10% battery. I tried to call for help, but the call wouldn't connect. Stuck. The reality of it sunk in. Jade sat on a chair, knees pulled to her chest, staring at the scarred side of the RV. Dylan tried to keep busy by packing up extraneous stuff, as though we could be ready to go the instant Mike got the engine started. I decided to see if I could find a ranger station, or at least a vantage point for phone reception. Dylan offered to come, but Jade seemed uncomfortable being left with Mike alone, so I went by myself. Walking through that forest alone was like wading into an endless sea of green and brown. The midday sun provided some comfort, but the quiet unnerved me. Occasionally I heard a distant bird or the rustle of a small animal, but the normal symphony of forest life seemed muffled. I followed the gravel path for a good half hour, checking my phone every so often for a signal. Nothing. Eventually the path forked. One way climbed a gentle slope, the other descended into a thicker patch of trees. I went up the slope, thinking maybe higher ground would help. I never did find a ranger station. Instead, I found what appeared to be an abandoned picnic area. 2 battered wooden tables near a fire pit filled with soggy ashes. As I turned to head back, I caught a glimpse of something moving between the trees. It was tall, unnaturally so, and pale. I froze, ducking behind a thick trunk, my heart hammering. Slowly I peeked out. Whatever it was stood at least 7 feet tall, limbs elongated, with joints that bent in ways that defied normal anatomy. I couldn't see its face clearly, just a vague shape where its head should be. I heard a low clicking or chattering sound, like bones rattling. My pulse pounded so loudly I worried it would hear me. Suddenly, it shifted its stance, turning in my direction. I flattened myself behind the tree. My mind spun wildly. Was this the thing that had circled our RV last night? The one that mimicked Jade's voice? The stench in the air was faint but present, making my eyes water. After a long, breathless minute, I heard it moving away, branches snapping underfoot as it retreated deeper into the forest. When the noise faded completely, I forced myself to count to 30 before daring to emerge. That was all I needed to see. I bolted back the way I came, nearly tripping on roots and rocks, ignoring the cuts from brambles that whipped my legs. When I burst into our campsite, Dylan and Mike jumped up, alarmed. Jade scrambled to her feet, eyes wide. I must have looked hysterical. I tried to explain, but my words spilled out in fragments. I saw, tall, white, in the woods, moving so wrong, smell, like last night. Mike stepped toward me, gripping my shoulders. Calm down. Deep breaths. He guided me to a chair. Jade knelt beside me, pressing a water bottle into my hands. I gulped half of it before I could speak clearly. Then I told them everything, from the shape of that creature to the horrifying sense that it was watching me. Dylan's expression shifted from concern to a kind of grim fascination. I could tell he believed me, which, in a twisted way, made it even scarier. Because if Mr. Skeptic was convinced, that meant we were dealing with something none of us could rationalize away. Jade started crying softly, shaking her head. "Let's leave," she repeated, her voice trembling. Mike tried the engine again, but it still wouldn't turn over. Dylan popped the hood, fiddled with some wires. No luck. Time crept by while we tried to figure out our next move. Finally, Dylan announced that he'd hike back the way we'd driven in and look for help. Maybe flag down another camper or a ranger. Jade practically clung to him, begging him not to go alone. I volunteered to go with him, but he insisted I stay and help Mike keep watch. He promised to be careful and took our only working flashlight and a hatchet. tucking it into his belt loop just in case. I watched him disappear down the gravel road, his steps hurried. For hours we waited. Mike tried tinkering with the RV again, but the mechanical problem seemed beyond him. Jade sat in tense silence. Occasionally she'd gasp at a noise in the trees, or she'd mutter a small prayer. I felt like I was in a dream, the kind where you're stuck in quicksand and can't move. Every time a twig snapped or the wind gusted, I jerked my head to see if that thing was sneaking up on us. Dusk settled in again, and still no sign of Dylan. I started to panic. If he'd found help, surely he would have been back by now, or at least we would have heard a car approaching. Mike paced the campsite, occasionally calling Dylan's name into the gathering darkness. No reply. Jade insisted we stay put in case Dylan returned, but I could see the fear on Mike's face too. He was just better at hiding it behind frustration and curses. Night came swiftly. We lit another campfire, though it felt like an invitation for everything out there to see us clearly. The RV's interior lights flickered, adding a surreal strobe effect to our dread. Jade kept whispering, "We shouldn't be here," and I couldn't argue. In the flicker of the campfire, I noticed something moving at the edge of the clearing. Mike saw it too, snatching up the hunting knife. "Who's there?" he called, voice cracking slightly. A moment later, Dylan stumbled into the light, looking half-crazed. Sweat and dirt streaked his face. He clutched the hatchet in one hand, the flashlight in the other. Relief flooded me at first. He was back, thank God. But then I realized he was alone. "There's nobody out there," he gasped. "No one. I walked for miles, I swear. The roads just ended or twisted. I don't even know. Couldn't find the turn we came in on." He dropped the hatchet and flashlight at his feet as if they weighed 1,000 pounds. Jade ran up, hugging him, but he just stared blankly, like a man returning from war. Mike pressed him for details, but Dylan just shook his head and slumped down next to the fire. An hour later, it happened again. That scratching along the RV. The soft, deliberate knocks on the door. Except this time it spoke in Dylan's voice. "Mike, open up," it said, perfectly mimicking Dylan's husky tone and casual speech pattern, even though Dylan sat right beside us. "It's me," the voice insisted. Mike, eyes wide, clutched his knife. "Stop it!" he yelled at the door. The voice continued. "I'm hurt. Let me in, man." Jade covered her ears. Dylan, pale, whispered to me, "That's exactly how I told him I'd come back if something went wrong." We didn't move. The knocks turned into bangs, each one rattling the RV. The stench returned full force, so thick it made my stomach churn. Then, without warning, something started climbing onto the roof. We heard the metal creak, the scraping of claws or nails. The overhead vent rattled. I could imagine it up there, crouching, peering in through the plastic skylight. Mike switched off every light inside. Maybe if we stayed quiet and dark it would move on. But that thing wasn't fooled. It dragged its claws across the roof, making a screech like nails on a chalkboard. Jade was on the brink of a full-blown panic attack. Dylan breathed in shallow gasps, eyes flicking to the door. Mike whispered furiously, "We need to get out of here. If the RV won't start, maybe we run." But run where? We had no idea which direction might lead to safety. The forest at night was a labyrinth. That thing was faster than us too, no doubt about it. Suddenly, a new noise rose above the scratching. An angry guttural growl. It vibrated through the metal, sending chills down my spine. The roof sagged slightly, as if this creature weighed more than a human body should. Then, just as quickly as it started, the noise ceased. For a moment, I thought it might have left. I risked edging toward the window to peek outside. In the faint moonlight, I saw a silhouette leap from the roof to the ground with shocking grace. It landed on all fours, limbs bent awkwardly, and craned its head toward me. My breath caught in my throat. Even from that distance I could see its eyes gleam in an unnatural reflection, like a cat's in the dark, but set in a face that looked twisted and skeletal. My heart hammered. Then it sprinted into the blackness, vanishing among the trees. We stayed locked in place, too stunned to move. Eventually, we realized the stench was fading. Jade, still shaking, asked if it was gone. None of us could say for sure, but it was the best chance we had. Mike decided to try starting the RV one more time. "If it doesn't work, we grab our stuff and walk," he said. Dylan, perhaps out of sheer desperation, nodded. We all piled into the front, Jade practically on my lap, fear radiating off her. Mike turned the key. The engine made its usual sputter, but this time, after a few agonizing coughs, it roared to life. A wave of joy collided with my terror, mixing into a delirious relief. "Go, go, go!" Dylan urged, eyes darting to the windows. Mike put the RV in drive, and we lurched forward. The clearing was surrounded by dense trees, the road a narrow path. Mike had to maneuver carefully so we wouldn't crash into a trunk, but every second we lingered felt like an hour. Finally, we found the gravel route. The headlights illuminated the forest tunnel ahead, spindly branches arching over us like skeletal arms. My heart pounded as we sped up. Then the RV lurched again, hitting a rut so deep I thought we'd blow a tire. Mike wrestled with the wheel, cursing under his breath. In the rearview mirror, I saw shadows dancing just outside the red glow of our tail lights. Something was following us, closing in fast, a pale shape flitting between the trees. "Faster!" Jade screamed. Mike pressed the pedal down and we bumped and jolted at breakneck speed, branches scraping against the sides. The old RV groaned in protest, but it held. At one point I heard a heavy thump on the roof. My mind conjured an image of that creature clinging to the top again, trying to peel it open. But as we rounded a sharp bend, whatever was up there slid off with a metallic screech. The last I saw of it was a flash of white in the side mirror, cartwheeling across the gravel. Then it vanished. We drove for nearly an hour, no one saying a word, until finally we spotted another battered sign for a county road. We took it, praying it led to civilization. The air felt different, less suffocating. Eventually, we came across a small gas station near the outskirts of the forest. It was closed for the night, but the lights in the lot were on, giving us a sense of security we hadn't felt in days. Mike cut the engine, and all four of us sat there in stunned silence, letting the adrenaline seep away. Dylan let out a shaky laugh, the sound half mad. Jade began to cry in earnest, burying her face in my shoulder. Mike exhaled so hard it was almost a sob. We slept in that gas station parking lot, all of us too exhausted to speak or move. At some point, a local sheriff's deputy found us there in the morning and knocked on the window. We told him our RV had engine trouble, but we didn't mention the creature. Who would believe us? He directed us to a nearby mechanic. From there, we limped home with the fear clinging to us like smoke. If the deputy noticed the scratches on the RV's side, or the terror in our eyes, he didn't press us about it. Dylan never brought up Wayne National Forest again. In fact, he stopped seeking out haunted or cursed spots. He sold off most of his ghost hunting gadgets and took up hiking in well-populated state parks instead. Jade refused to camp for a year after that, and even now, she insists on campgrounds with other people around. Mike helped me with repairs to the RV. His cousin never asked too many questions about the damage, probably assuming we'd had an accident. As for me, I still dream of that voice, my own or Jade's or Dylan's, calling from the woods, pleading to be let in. Sometimes I see the creature's pale silhouette in the corner of my vision when I'm alone in a dark room. I jump at scratching noises outside my apartment window. Rationally, I know it can't be the same thing. But once you've looked into the eyes of something that shouldn't exist, that logic doesn't bring much comfort. I'm telling this story now because part of me hopes it'll exorcise the nightmares, or at least warn someone else before they venture too far into those silent woods. If you ever find yourself in Wayne National Forest and the wilderness grows unnaturally quiet, if you smell decay on the breeze and hear a voice that seems just a little off, trust your instincts. Leave. Because there's something out there, beyond the well-marked trails and scenic vistas. Something that mimics us, preys on our curiosity and fear, and slinks through the darkness with impossible grace. It may watch from a distance at first, but if you give it the chance, it will draw closer. And if you hear that quiet knock on your door late at night, don't answer it. Whatever's outside, it's not human, and it wants in. My name is Harper Ross. I'm 34 years old, and this happened just a few weeks after my divorce became final. I had no real plan except to drive my old RV to Zaleski State Forest in Ohio and try to lose myself in the serene stillness of nature. I'm a freelance photographer by trade, always chasing that elusive perfect shot, and I told myself that this trip would be just another chance to capture haunting autumn scenery. I had no idea how literal the word haunting would become. I arrived in mid-November. The leaves were almost gone from the trees, leaving only bare branches that formed a kind of skeletal canopy overhead. Now and then, a stray gust would send a cluster of brown leaves whirling across the road. I remember turning onto a narrow, winding route. Most of the signage had probably been replaced or removed. My outdated GPS insisted I stay on a gravel road that spat stones against the undercarriage of the RV. Everything rattled, but I tried to stay optimistic. I was alone, intentionally so, trying to pretend solitude was exactly what I needed. Eventually, the gravel turned into something that resembled a dirt path. Every once in a while, I'd glimpse an old wooden sign with an arrow, half covered in moss, pointing further in. My engine complained about every dip and rut, but I managed. I was determined to reach the campsite Ranger Miller had recommended during our brief phone conversation a few days earlier. He'd seemed friendly enough, if a bit curt. Just, don't wander off the trails at night, and don't hesitate to stop by the station if you need something. That was it. At the time, I'd thought it was standard forest ranger talk. When I finally spotted a small clearing tucked between tall oaks and maples, I exhaled. A battered metal plaque near the entrance read, Site 22. Piles of dead leaves surrounded a solitary fire ring, and there was just enough space to park my RV without scraping the nearby trunks. My black and white cat, Pip, meowed in annoyance from her crate, so I took that as a sign of approval. At least neither of us had to keep driving. The late afternoon sky was flat gray, threatening drizzle, but I still felt a faint sense of peace. There's something comforting about an empty forest when you believe you have it all to yourself. I parked, set the handbrake, and hopped out to stretch. The air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of damp earth. I didn't see any other campers, not even in the distance. One quick phone check confirmed my suspicion. No reception. Perfect, I thought. No calls from my ex, no last-minute demands from clients. I'd wanted isolation, and I'd gotten it. I spent the rest of the day settling in, unloading my photography gear, a fold-out chair, and a small portable grill. The silence was almost unnerving. Back in my old life, I couldn't stand silence. Too many anxious thoughts had a habit of filling the void. But I was trying to lean into it now, to let it envelop me like a thick blanket. If guilt or regret came up, well, I'd face it. Alone, if necessary. Dusk set in early. By 5, the light had already started fading behind the leafless canopy. I grilled a quick meal of veggies and chicken, sipped some instant coffee, and watched the flicker of my small campfire. The wind picked up, rustling branches overhead, making them creak like ancient wooden rafters. Pip prowled around the perimeter of the site on her leash, hissing at shadows. When it got too cold, we retreated into the RV, locked up, and settled in for the night. I read from a tattered paperback for an hour or so, then dozed off to the sound of wind whistling. If that had been my entire trip, it would have been so peaceful. But it wasn't. The next morning brought a brief moment of sunlight. I brewed more coffee on my small propane stove, fed Pip, and decided to explore. I took my camera, a spare battery, and some water, then headed for a trailhead I'd seen on the drive-in. The leaves crunched under my boots, and I felt that tingle of excitement I always get when I'm about to photograph an interesting landscape. The forest was quiet, except for the occasional caw of a crow. I snapped shots of tree roots snaking across the ground, close-ups of fungi on rotting logs, and beams of light shining through the sparse canopy. As I passed a slight bend, I noticed a woman standing by a large oak, adjusting the strap on her backpack. She was maybe in her late 20s, wearing a green hiking jacket. I couldn't tell if she was startled or just cautious. We exchanged quick greetings. She introduced herself as Emily, said she was local-ish, out for a day hike. Relieved to find another human in this emptiness, I asked if she'd camped out here before. She hesitated a moment, then said yes, once or twice. She added, "But not in late autumn. People tell stories about hearing children at dusk." "Children?" I echoed. My interest piqued. She shrugged. "Yeah, it's probably just local folklore. Something about a tragedy at an old logging camp. But if you're going to be out here alone, maybe just keep an ear out." Then she gave a small, awkward smile, lifted her pack, and trudged off. I stood there for a moment, feeling the wind nip my ears, trying to decide if she was pulling my leg or giving a genuine warning. I decided to let it go. I'd encountered enough local legends in my travels. Ghost trains, haunted cabins, you name it. Most turned out to be just local color. I spent another hour hiking, eventually circling back toward my RV. My plan was to drive into the closest town, only a half hour away if I remembered correctly, to grab fresh groceries. But when I fired up the engine, it sputtered ominously. A flicker of lights on the dashboard, and then nothing. I muttered a curse. My mechanical knowledge is minimal at best. I opened the hood to pretend I was checking something, saw a tangle of wires, and quickly gave up. I was still plenty stocked for a day or two, so I decided not to panic. If worst came to worst, I'd walk to the ranger station I'd passed on the edge of the forest. Early afternoon dripped into late afternoon seamlessly. I spent the time walking around, snapping photos, and trying to forget my engine troubles. Sometime around 4, I heard a car in the distance, a faint engine hum, but it never came near my campsite. The wind again started picking up, colder now, carrying the scent of damp leaves and something else I couldn't place. Decay, maybe? I chalked it up to a rotting log somewhere. That night, the forest seemed quieter than before. At first, I appreciated the stillness. Then it hit me how unnaturally quiet it was. No owls, no rustling of small animals scurrying. Just long stretches of silence, broken occasionally by the groan of a tree swaying. Pip was unusually restless, wandering from window to window, letting out low, throaty meows. I crawled into the makeshift bed in the back, telling myself it was just typical wildlife hiding from the dropping temperature. Sometimes, especially in late autumn, the woods fall dead silent. The time was around midnight when I snapped awake. Pip was perched at the small window that faced the fire ring. She was rigid, tail puffed out. That's when I realized I was hearing something faint, drifting through the hush of the night. At first it resembled the faint echo of laughter, childlike giggling, distant enough that I wondered if I was dreaming. Then I heard a single word, or maybe a name, in a soft, high-pitched voice. I couldn't make it out clearly. My heart drummed. There shouldn't be children out here. Not at this hour. Not in the off-season. And definitely not alone. I slipped out of bed and quietly tiptoed to the window. The darkness outside was nearly complete, except for the moonlight casting silver shapes through the skeletal branches. I flicked on the small exterior light above the RV door. The glow reached maybe 10 feet, illuminating only a patch of ground and the cold fire ring. Nothing moved. The laughter, or what I thought I'd heard, was gone. The silence felt heavier now, oppressive. Pip hissed once, then slunk away from the window. My skin prickled with goosebumps, and I had to remind myself to breathe. After several minutes of motionless waiting, I snapped the light off and crawled back into bed. It took a long time for my racing thoughts to settle. I must have dozed off sometime near 2 or 3 in the morning. The next day, I tried to dismiss the midnight voices as a half-formed dream, but my nerves were on edge. I decided to head for the ranger station on foot to ask for help with the RV. On my way, I stopped at a dusty old gas station near the forest's boundary, hoping I'd find some local who could at least direct me to a mechanic. The place looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. Flickering fluorescent lights, cracked linoleum floors, and a clerk behind the counter reading a magazine. He was elderly, wore thick-rimmed glasses, and looked up at me with mild curiosity. "Need something, miss?" he asked. I bought a candy bar and a coffee, then explained my engine problem. He gave a slow, thoughtful nod. "Ain't many mechanics around here. You might try the next county over." I pressed him for help, maybe a phone number. He shrugged. "Landline's been spotty. Storm took out some lines last week." He studied me a moment, then added, "Not many folks camping in Zaleski this time of year. Folks around here say them woods get noisy come dark." "Noisy how?" I asked, a prickle of déjà vu creeping over me. He let out a low chuckle that turned into a cough. "You'll see, or hear maybe." With that cryptic reply, he handed me my change. "Best watch yourself. This time of year, them old tragedies like to surface. Logs break free. Spirits too, maybe." At that, he just gave me a polite nod and went back to his magazine. Great, I thought. Another local legend. I forced a thin smile, stepped back into the cold air, and tried not to read too much into his warning. Ranger Miller wasn't at his station, just a note pinned to the door that he was patrolling the forest back by late afternoon. Terrific. I eyed the sky, which was clouding over, threatening rain or maybe even a light snow. I walked the couple miles back to my site, resigned to either waiting for Miller to show up or hitchhiking out if a car passed by. The rest of the afternoon, I snapped more pictures, wandered carefully around the trails, and came upon a surprising discovery. A dilapidated cabin far off the main path. It looked like a holdover from some old logging operation. Its roof sagged inward, and the door hung on a single rusted hinge. A signboard leaned against the side, the lettering too faded to read. For a moment, curiosity tugged me. My camera was itching for a shot of the interior's decayed aesthetic. But something about the place made the hairs on my neck stand up. I remembered Emily's mention of a tragedy. This could easily be related, a leftover building from that era. My heart fluttered uneasily. I took a few exterior shots, but I couldn't bring myself to go inside. Some primal part of me insisted I leave it alone. Nightfall came quickly again. This time, the wind carried a slight drizzle, which occasionally tapped at the RV's roof. I tried reading, but my mind kept drifting to the stories, the kids' laughter, the old clerk's cryptic warning. Pip prowled again, unsettled, as though she sensed something in the shadows. By midnight I dozed off, only to wake with a jolt at a series of soft taps on my RV door. 3 gentle raps, as if a small knuckle was testing the metal. I froze, heart thudding. Another 3 knocks, a little louder this time. Pip yowled and bolted to hide under the table. My fingers shook as I reached for the small flashlight on the counter. "Hello?" I called, my voice cracking. No answer, just a barely audible rustling outside. I steeled myself, then flicked on the flashlight and opened the blinds an inch. In the thin beam of light through the window, I saw movement, a small figure retreating behind a tree, child-sized, not an animal but shaped like a person. I gasped, stumbling backward, nearly dropping the flashlight. Some strange maternal instinct made me think, could a lost kid be out there? But that question had barely formed before I remembered how bizarre this was. Why would a child roam the forest alone at midnight, tapping on strangers' RV doors? My fear escalated to dread. I locked the door, latched it, checked the windows. Part of me wanted to fling the door open and see if someone needed help. The rest of me was screaming that it was a trap, or worse, something not even human. That night felt endless. I lay on the small bed, listening. Occasionally, I'd hear faint giggles again, or light footsteps circling. Around 3 a.m, the footsteps vanished, and silence descended. Somehow, I drifted off, fully clothed, one hand clutching the flashlight. Dawn arrived with a gentle drizzle. My eyes felt gritty from lack of sleep. I was determined now. I had to speak to Ranger Miller. I set off on foot once more. The cold rain needled my cheeks, and I nearly lost my footing on some wet leaves. By the time I reached the station, my clothes were damp, and my mood was darker than the sky overhead. Thankfully, the door stood open, and a tall, broad-shouldered man with a ranger's patch on his sleeve was tidying up what looked like a desk of radio equipment. He turned when I entered. "You Harper Ross?" he asked, as if he'd been expecting me. I blinked, caught off guard. He introduced himself as Ranger Miller, said he'd gotten a message from my ex, of all people, who'd apparently tried to call me, found no signal, and eventually tracked down the station's number. So my ex was worried? Great. Just what I needed. Without waiting for me to bring it up, he asked, "You having trouble with your RV? I heard you might need a mechanic." I breathed a sigh of relief, explained the trouble, then hesitated, unsure whether I should mention the knocks and childlike laughter. Finally, I just blurted it out. "Look, there's something off in the forest at night. I keep hearing kids, or something pretending to be kids." Ranger Miller's expression didn't change much, but his eyes flickered with a hint of recognition. Locals have told stories about that for years. Some logging camp accident decades ago, if the legends are correct. A group of families lived in these woods during the logging season. Winter came early, a storm trapped them, and the children didn't make it out. That's how the story goes. Some folks claim those kids wander at night calling out for help. He paused, then added, "But in my years patrolling, I've never seen anything." His shrug was half-hearted. "Maybe I just haven't been at the wrong place at the wrong time." I thanked him, half relieved he didn't laugh. He promised to swing by my site that afternoon with a jump-starter kit. After that, I trudged back, feeling exposed under the gray sky, as though something was watching me. The forest stillness seemed to weigh heavier with each step. True to his word, Ranger Miller arrived around 1. He messed with the RV's battery, fiddled with wires, and managed to get the engine to cough to life. I practically cheered. I invited him in for a hot drink, but he declined, had to check on some other campsites. Before he left, he said, "If you're uneasy, maybe stay at a campground closer to the main road. Not as scenic, but fewer rumors." I told him I'd think about it. He nodded and drove off in his dusty truck. I almost followed him, but a stubborn streak in me insisted I'd come here to find solitude, and I wouldn't let local legends chase me away. That evening, I grilled some dinner, planning to sleep early and leave the next morning before the weather worsened. My camera was full of forest shots. I'd gotten the quiet I craved, more or less, and I felt it was time to go. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a cold wind sprang up. The drizzle turned into a steady, pattering rain, hissing against the dying campfire. I retreated into the RV, sealed up everything, and changed into dry clothes. The hours stretched out. 11 p.m., midnight. The patter of rain was almost comforting, but I couldn't quite relax. My nerves were drawn tight and Pip was pacing again. Then around midnight, the lights flickered. I cursed under my breath, afraid my battery was going haywire. But the flickering continued in a rhythmic pattern, almost like something was messing with the exterior power source. A faint scraping sound drifted from beneath the vehicle, as if a child or small animal might be crawling around down there. I grabbed my flashlight and opened the small storage hatch in the RV floor to see if something had gotten inside. Nothing. Then I heard a giggle from right outside the main door. A child's voice whispered, "Let me in." So softly I almost thought I'd imagined it. My pulse pounded. Another voice joined in, equally soft. "Please, we're cold." The doorknob rattled. Even Pip let out an unnatural howl, arching her back. My breath came in short gasps. I braced against the back wall, flashlight pointed at the door, though rationally I knew a flashlight was no defense. "Go away!" I managed to shout. The voices stopped for a second. Then a little hand, or what looked like a little hand, slammed against the window. The glass rattled and I saw the faint outline of small fingers. My flashlight beam caught a glimpse, a pale bluish face with hollow eyes pressed against the pane. My heart nearly exploded. It looked so much like a child, but something about the proportions was off. The face was too drawn, the eyes too large, watery and sorrowful. Before I could blink, the face vanished. Another giggle floated around the other side near the back door. A swirl of frantic footsteps circled the RV, accompanied by occasional tapping on the walls, like a group of children at recess, drumming their hands. I kept expecting to see them in the windows, but they moved too quickly, or too unpredictably. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I wanted to run, to drive off, but how could I face the swirling storm and those shapes outside? I heard one voice again from what sounded like the roof. "We're lost," it whimpered, pitiful, almost drawing out my sympathy. Then the roof creaked under shifting weight. My rational brain screamed, "Don't believe them. This isn't normal." As if to confirm that, the next voice was guttural, an undertone of anger behind the childlike pitch. "Stay with us." The roof creaked harder, as though something was kneeling or crawling above me. Tears slid down my cheeks, unbidden. My thoughts were jumbled with guilt, with the memory of my own regrets, my marriage that fell apart, my avoidance of having kids, all the what-if scenarios I'd tried not to revisit. These ghostly children seemed to stir that regret into a potent dread. I felt a powerful, choking sadness. Was that their trick? To lure me out by mimicking my own pain? The flickering lights died completely. Darkness swallowed the interior. Pip hissed and dove under the table. I fumbled for my phone, but it was dead. No charge left. "Think, Harper," I muttered to myself, choking on fear. "They're not real. They're not real." But I knew better. Something out there was very real, and the presence was stifling. The pounding on the roof moved to the door again, then to the walls, like a group of ghosts playing tag. I slammed my fists against the countertop, torn between raw terror and a wave of sorrow so deep it felt like I was drowning in it. "Leave me alone!" I screamed. The only response was a child's sob echoing from just outside. Then came an eerie hush. A swirl of desperate courage welled up inside me. I grabbed a camera flash from my equipment bag, a portable strobe I sometimes used for night photography. If these things were indeed spirits, maybe a sudden burst of light could disrupt them. Or maybe I was just grasping at straws. My hands shaking, I popped open the door. Rain slapped my face. Darkness and wind swallowed me as I leapt out. Instantly I saw them. Several small figures in ragged silhouettes, barely distinguishable from the gloom. They ringed the RV, their heads turning in unison to look at me. No eyes glinted, no reflection, just hollow shadows in the shape of children. Lightning quick, one darted forward, nearly close enough to brush my leg. I raised the strobe and fired. A bright, harsh flash lit the clearing. In that frozen instant, I saw them clearly. Ghostly forms, their clothing tattered and mud-streaked, their faces twisted with longing or pain. Then the night swallowed them again. A chorus of wails erupted, high and anguished. They scattered around me, flickering like images caught between realms. One reached out a small hand, brushing my arm with an icy sting. Instinct made me stagger back. I fired another flash. This time, most of them disappeared into the darkness of the trees. All but one, which lingered at the edge of the clearing. A little girl, perhaps, with hair plastered to her face. She opened her mouth as if to cry, but no sound came out. Then she vanished too. I stood there in the pouring rain, panting, soaked to the bone. The strobe's battery died in my hand, and with it went my last line of defense. My eyes darted around, searching for any hint of movement. Slowly, the wailing faded. The presence receded, as though I'd disrupted some sort of hold they had on the immediate area. I felt shaky, nauseated, overwhelmed by a swirl of emotions. Pity for these lost souls, dread of what they truly were, and an echo of my own regrets that refused to let me go. I scrambled back into the RV, slammed the door, and locked it again. Tears streamed down my face as I curled up on the floor, clutching Pip, who was trembling in my arms. A half hour passed before I worked up the nerve to stand. The pounding of rain masked any lesser sound outside, but I sensed the ghosts weren't gone for good. I needed to leave. Now. Steeling myself, I slid into the driver's seat and turned the key, half convinced the engine would fail me again. Miraculously, it caught on the first try. The headlights illuminated a sheet of rain ahead. My hands shook so badly, it took me 3 attempts to shift into drive. But I did it. The RV lumbered forward, bouncing over the muddy ruts. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see small figures chasing after me. But all I saw was darkness and the faint flicker of bare-limbed trees like silent watchers. Guiding the RV through that forest at night in the storm was a terrifying ordeal. I nearly slid off the path twice, my windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. Branches scraped the sides, screeching like nails on a chalkboard. Every gust of wind made me flinch, imagining the ghosts returning to throw themselves against the vehicle. But mile by mile I pressed on, pressed. Eventually, the path widened into a paved county road. Relief washed over me, an almost painful release of tension. I kept driving until I spotted the faint glow of the gas station's neon sign. It was closed, of course, but the overhang provided a small refuge from the storm. I parked, cut the engine, and let my forehead fall onto the steering wheel, sobbing out the fear and horror I'd suppressed. At dawn, the sky cleared enough that I could see a hint of pink on the horizon. My phone managed a small charge after I plugged it into a battered car adapter. I dialed a number for a mechanic, explained my situation, and eventually arranged to meet them in a town a few miles up the road. I never set foot in Zaleski State Forest again. In the weeks since, I've tried to piece together what happened. Did I really see ghosts of children, or were they illusions spawned by exhaustion and fear? The scratches on my RV's paint suggest something tangible was out there. My camera gear revealed a single photograph from that night, taken by accident as I scrambled with the strobe. In the digital image, there's a faint shape near the edge of the frame. Small, blurred, but unmistakably childlike. A face, half-formed. I can't bear to look at it for long. Sometimes I dream of them. Pale, sad-eyed children peering through the windows, whispering my name. In the dream, I stand in a rotted cabin, old logging tools strewn about, and I see them huddled in corners, shivering, calling out for help. But in those dreams, when I reach for them, their faces twist into expressions of anger and betrayal. I always wake up with tears in my eyes. I like to think I escaped physically, and in some sense, emotionally. Yet part of me wonders if I left a piece of my soul behind in those shadowy woods, where lost children roam, searching for a warmth that vanished decades ago. I can't shake the feeling that if I hadn't fled, they would have kept me there, wrapped me in that choking sorrow, using my regrets as links in a chain. Maybe I was lucky. Maybe they let me go because I glimpsed their pain for that one fleeting moment and felt genuine compassion. Or maybe they'll come for me again someday. For now, I live in a small apartment in Columbus, far from any forest. I still take photos, mostly cityscapes at dusk. I avoid lonely roads, deserted campsites, and the hush of nighttime woods. If I ever camp again, it'll be in a crowded park full of loud, happy families. No illusions, no phantoms. But a tiny part of me wonders if the presence I felt in Zaleski was truly evil, or if it was simply echoing the heartbreak of children caught in a timeless tragedy. I'll never have a solid answer. The forest keeps its secrets well. All I know is that I'll never forget the nights I spent there alone, nor the pale faces pressed against my window, nor the gentle, terrible voices that pleaded, "Let me in." And if you ever find yourself in Zaleski State Forest late in the season, and the woods fall silent around you, be wary. Some echoes of the past are more persistent than others. and they might just be waiting for someone with enough sorrow in their heart to hear their call.